So in terms of the students of Alan Chadwick, one of my mentors, Dr. Jeff Creek, who studied with Alan Chadwick in Covelo, inspired me very much towards this idea of a fiber shed. What is it going to look like when we localize the soil to soil system at a regional scale? What are the ecosystem realities of localization? What does it mean for the precipitation patterns we have, the grasslands, the forests, the croplands, the systems that are anthropogenically engaged with, which are most of Earth's systems? How are we going to procure and have reciprocal relationship with land so that we can regenerate the systems that regenerate us? These are like the fundamental questions that our organization and myself personally continues to ask. So we're pivoting in this conversation into ecosystems at the regional scale. So the learnings that we have in our community with our precipitation pattern, geomorphology, biogeochemical realities, we hope it inspires you to think about your place, which will have very different ecosystem components, and to think, what does regionalization of this system look like? What is the expression of natural dye, fiber, texture, color, food that comes from the soil of my place? So we keep asking that, and this next conversation will be led by Mike Conover, who is the climate beneficial ag technician for Fibershed. He has started with us 5 months ago. He has a global perspective, having traveled to different parts of the world to look at agricultural projects, particularly agroforestry. He has a background in doing design, site design, and just good hands-on practical skills. Having gotten to work with him in our learning center, he is great in the garden. So we will pivot. Mike, thank you for facilitating this next conversation on agroforestry, and I will let you just take it away.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so we're going to dig a little deeper into the implications of our land management practices and how we can root our fiber and food economies not in the exploitative or extractive models that we're surrounded by with industrial monocultures, but in models more based in land stewardship and land regeneration. So we're going to talk about agroforestry as a model and a system. I'm going to introduce it, define it, go over some of the benefits of these different types of practices, describe the 5 different types of agroforestry systems, and then we'll bring in our panelists. We have a great group of people here to dig even deeper into this. They'll all give some presentations, and then we'll have a discussion amongst all of us, and then open it up for a Q&A. So what is agroforestry and why is it relevant? Essentially, agroforestry at its most basic is agriculture that involves trees. The USDA defines it as the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into crop and animal farming systems to create environmental, economic, and social benefits. For a management practice to be called agroforestry, people talk about the 4 I's, that they're intentional, integrated, intensive, and interactive. So I think we all intuitively know that trees bring with them a whole slew of different benefits. Carbon drawdown, so for climate change mitigation, food in the form of protein from nuts or fruit, timber, animal fodder, wildlife habitat, oxygen creation, climate buffering, soil stabilization. I could go on and on about why trees are great. By having more diversified cropping and livestock systems, we can support the overall resiliency of farms and ranches. We can harness the positive biological and ecological interactions between trees and shrubs and other crops or the livestock. So for example, increased nutrient cycling, improved soil health and structure, nitrogen fixation, supporting the ability of a landscape to retain moisture, as well as providing shade for animals to reduce stress. So how do we do that? These are certainly not new ideas. People have been working with agroforestry systems for thousands and thousands of years, just hasn't always been called this. Many native cultures over the course of history have tended and managed the forests and woodlands and savannas and other ecosystems with a high degree of sophistication and with much more complexity than is typically discussed. There are 2,000-year-old food forests in Morocco that have featured an overstory of date palms with an understory of olives, figs, pomegranates, bananas, guavas, citrus, mulberries, tamarind, carob, quince, and grapes, all growing together as part of an integrated system. There's the Dehesa system in Portugal, based on a savanna-like ecosystem where cattle and sheep and goats graze beneath primarily oaks in an integrated system that produces cork, Iberian pigs, wild game, mushrooms, honey, firewood, and other crops. So there's plenty of examples, and it's always going to be different depending on the local region. What does that piece of land want to be? What's the climax ecosystem or the potential natural vegetation of that land, and then using that to model a system off of. So there are 5 main types of agroforestry practices. There's alley cropping, where you would have rows of trees that are alternating with alleys of annual or perennial crops, and you could have livestock grazing between them. There's silvopasture, where trees and livestock are integrated together, so the trees can provide additional crops, as well as shade for the animals to reduce heat stress, make them more comfortable. Windbreaks, kind of self-explanatory. You'd have rows of trees or shrubs planted to shelter animals, buildings, prevent soil erosion. Riparian buffers, essentially restoring the areas along creeks and streams to prevent erosion and filter runoff. And then forest farming is growing food, herbs, mushrooms, other crops under a full forest canopy. So it's just kind of a lot of information, just agroforestry primer to lead into this discussion. So bring in our panelists at this point. We have a great group.
Want to do the poll, Mike?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's do that poll just to gauge people's familiarity. So we have a poll here, just to get a sense on, before this conversation, how familiar are you with agroforestry? Have you heard of it before? Are you actively implementing practices on your land base, or maybe never heard of it at all?
We're at about 60%. We're just going to wait till we get over 75%.
Sure.
So we've almost got everybody, and then give everybody a few more seconds, maybe 10 seconds just to vote. So if you get an opportunity, it should be on your screen right now. You can just select one of the choices, and then we will stop the share and go for it. Just waiting for a few more people to vote, and then we'll close it down. So you got a few more seconds. All right, and 3, 2, 1. We're ending the poll.
Thank you, Gavin. Okay, cool. So most people, 47%, are somewhat familiar, followed by not familiar at all. So this is a great opportunity to do some learning and education and dive into the potential here. So we have 4 panelists here, an amazing group of people. We have Dr. Sonja Brodt of UC Sarup. We have Jesse Smith of White Buffalo Land Trust. We have Dr. Liz Carlisle of UC Santa Barbara, and we have Guido Frosini of Truegrass Farms. And so they'll each be giving a presentation, providing some insight into the work and endeavors, and then we'll have a discussion. So we'll start with Sonja. Dr. Sonja Brodt is the Associate Director of UC Sarup, and that's the Sustainable Agriculture Research Education Program at UC Davis. She coordinates the Ag and Environment theme there. Her research and education has been focusing on increasing the adoption of regenerative practices, conserving natural resources, harnessing biodiversity for better agricultural and environmental outcomes, and helping producers mitigate and adapt to climate change. Her recent projects focus on comprehensive training for beginning organic farmers, creating new models for native species hedgerows that include commercial harvest of native species such as blue elderberry, and creating a database of successful practices for cover crop management. So I think she's with us. Take it away, Sonja.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me see about sharing my screen here.
if this works.
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah,
Yep.
see it great.
Okay, so
I am with the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, which is actually a statewide program of the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources. So that's the whole extension branch of the University of California. And we work closely with cooperative extension offices throughout the counties and different people on different campuses as well. So let me see, that worked. Okay, so I just want to give a quick overview of agroforestry, some of the agroforestry practices in California. So as probably most of this audience knows, we face a lot of environmental and economic challenges in California agriculture, like drought and climate change, which partly causes the drought, and as well as other effects. Water pollution from runoff and leaching of nitrates and different elements, and biodiversity loss, labor shortages, many different things, and that's just to name a few. So what we really need is ecological intensification as one approach to addressing these challenges. And so by that, I mean actually designing systems so that you can best harness the natural processes that keep agroecosystems functioning and healthy, like natural ecosystems. And so there's two different ways to approach ecological intensification. One is to make a system more perennial, because like Mike already mentioned, a lot of the benefits of trees in a landscape, you know, there's constant living roots in the ground, which really changes the dynamics below ground. And there's more complexity above ground as well. And so that really helps provide more habitat for different things and kind of increases the different types of biology happening in your system. And then the other thing is diversification, just increasing the biological diversity in our agroecosystems overall. And so I really like agroforestry, because not that it's the be all and end all for every problem, but it actually is an approach that does both of these things. It increases the perennial aspects of systems, and it diversifies our systems. So I want to illustrate this with one example here, that is a system that we do see in California, especially around the North Coast area. Not in huge numbers, but more and more there's interest growing in this system, which is sheep grazing and vineyards. And so my colleague at UC Davis, Dr. Amelie Gaudin, has done some studies on this with her students. And so first, when you're growing cover crops in vineyards, which I highly recommend doing, you're already gaining a lot of benefits, like you can limit nutrient loss because you have those cover crop roots in the ground, especially during the rainy season. There's more weed control, pest suppression and habitat for beneficial insects. So you have those things going on, but what they found was if you add in this whole other element of sheep, you actually get more benefits. So they found that even beyond just cover cropping, by having sheep grazing during the rainy season, there's even more increases in soil carbon and nitrogen deposition in the soil. The physical structure of the soil improves. There's more aggregation, so clumping of small soil particles, and that helps to hold carbon for a long time, and also helps to hold nutrients and prevent erosion. And there was more microbial diversity in the soil as well with the sheep grazing. And then those things can also translate into economic benefits. So the sheep actually act like your mowing equipment, and so you can reduce the mowing and herbicide use in a vineyard. And they found through surveys of vineyard managers that that can lead to savings of from anywhere $87 to $174 an acre. Some vineyards also use sheep for leaf plucking, and that's a big labor savings. It can help with fire prevention and also marketing opportunities. It's kind of a charismatic kind of thing, and you can show people coming around to your vineyard that you're having these animals integrated, and sometimes that can really help with the publicity. So some work that we have been doing at UC Sarup is on looking at how we can kind of economically intensify hedgerows, native species hedgerows, which are planted along farm edges. There's already a lot of great research out there from colleagues across the UC system and other places that show that hedgerows planted along crop fields help with carbon sequestration. One of my colleagues did a study of a tomato farm in California, or actually here in Yolo County, and they found that the hedgerows could store 18% of the whole farm landscape's total carbon, even though it occupied only 6% of the land area of the farm. So that's a real plus for climate change. We've also had other studies that showed that there's more habitat and food for wildlife and pollinators and other beneficial insects. In fact, a study also in Yolo County showed that hedgerows increased the pollination rates of adjacent canola crops compared to fields in the same area that did not have hedgerows. And in tomato fields, they showed a decreased need for insecticide use when there was a hedgerow present. And these effects go quite a ways into the field. I think they studied at least 200 feet or something like that. Like it really went quite a distance into the field that you get these effects. And then there's also water quality protection and runoff prevention. But hedgerows can be, especially native species hedgerows, can be expensive to plant because those native species cost a lot to buy from nurseries. So we were looking at what can we do to kind of incentivize more hedgerow planting. And here's this species, blue elderberry, that is already often a component of native species hedgerows. It grows really well. The map, the yellow shading on the map shows where blue elderberry is found in California. It's basically from almost coastal areas up until about 10,000 feet in elevation. So it grows really well in many different microclimates in California, and it's quite drought and heat tolerant. More so, we think, than maybe the eastern species of elderberries and the European elderberries that are mostly used in commercial production and commercial products these days. And on top of that, elderberry, blue elderberry has a long history of stewardship by California Native tribes. They have used it for many different things for eons and are very familiar and have a strong relationship with the plant. So there's a lot to build on there. And finally, elderberry sales, elderberry products like syrups and immune boosting products have been very popular. Even before the pandemic, sales were going up tremendously. And then in the first half of 2020, they even more than doubled or tripled actually in sales. And people in the industry I've talked to feel that this trend is going to continue. It's not just a fad, is what they say. So we looked at, we did some trials with farmers who actually came up with this idea for this project. And here in the Sacramento Valley, we established some hedgerows with a high proportion of elderberry and also other species. And we found that, well, hedgerow establishment costs usually are around $3,000 to $4,000 for a 1,000-foot hedgerow. And we found that if you harvest the elderberry, just the berries, you can also harvest flowers. We didn't even study that, but just harvesting the berries. And by year 3, when the plants are not even totally mature yet, you can already get from between $2,000 to over $6,000 in potential revenue if you sell the frozen bulk berries. Now, these farms were actually small scale farms. They were doing much more value added production with their elderberries, making syrups on farm and selling them in direct market situations. So they were probably making more than that from that effort. So and as we know, elderberries can get quite large. That picture with the ladder, that's an 8-foot orchard ladder. So if you have a series of those size trees, we also measured the yield of these larger trees as far as one can pick, not even picking all the way to the top. And so I estimated from that there's a future market value potential of over $12,000 for a 1,000-foot hedgerow in good conditions. However, I don't want to make it sound like there's a company ready, set to buy miles and miles of hedgerow worth of elderberry. The market needs more development. There's a lot of small scale markets and small scale herbal co-ops and herbalists and people like that buying it. So there is a lot of small scale trade in blue elderberry going on in California, but otherwise the market can, it needs some more development.
Hey, Sonja, just to let you know, you have about a minute left.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, just finishing up. So as Mike mentioned, there's other agroforestry systems also. And actually the agricultural census in 2017 found that over 1,000 farms in California reported having one or more of these practices out of about 70,000 farms. So it's maybe 1.5% of the farms. So there are people doing it. It's not very widespread yet, but I feel like there's a lot of potential. And I just want to leave you with a reference to our websites where you can find more information. Our main syrup website, you can get to everything from there ultimately, but we also have a separate elderberry site. And if you're interested in a more academic kind of lecture on the science of agroforestry, you can look at this YouTube link or just Google permaculture for peace, agroforestry, and my name, and you'll come up with about an hour long or a 50-minute or so YouTube lecture on agroforestry that goes more into the science. And I'll see if I could put the link into the chat later too. So I'll stop sharing now and I think we can move on. Let's see.
All right.
There we go.
Thank you so much, Sonja. There's so much information, research that you've been doing. It's incredible. We'll bring in Jesse Smith next. Jesse is the Director of Land Stewardship at the White Buffalo Land Trust and has been working for the past decade to develop a resilient food economy in California's Central Coast region. He's an agricultural producer with a background in communication and industrial design and has devoted his life to agricultural system design and community development to achieve evolutionary change within our food economy and ecology. He's currently working to catalyze systemic change with the 1,000-acre Center for Regenerative Agriculture at Halama Canyon Ranch, and he'll be sharing a bit about that as well. So take it away, Jesse.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks, Sonja, for laying such a great foundation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. As Mike mentioned, my organizational affiliation is White Buffalo Land Trust, and we're a nonprofit organization located here in Central Coastal California. And this image here just reminds me of so much of the potential that we have here within our community, within our ecology, within our landscape at large. And this integration of annuals and animals and perennials is, for me, what I feel is the task of our time. And so this is a little snapshot of the Halama Canyon Ranch, but for me, speaks a lot to both the degradation that has happened in the past, but also the tapestry that we get to paint our future upon. Looking at our organization, we have a theory of change that really is rooted in land stewardship. We want to have everything that we do really foundationally based in our hands in the soil and our feet on the ground. And so our organization works across multiple landscapes, and I'll speak about two of them today, but we have a 12-acre flagship farm in Summerlin, California, that is a transitioning legacy avocado orchard, where we have a demonstration site to talk about climate appropriate crops and cropping systems, everything from subtropical to Mediterranean to arid dry land and kind of desert planting. We're able to talk about nutrient cycling and composting, about nursery development and propagation, as well as farm planning and design. We also, as Mike mentioned, just were able to close escrow on a 1,000-acre ranch near Lompoc, California on Halama Road that is focused more on kind of broadacre agroforestry, livestock management, and really is the center that we will be continuing to build our organizational programs around. Those programs really revolve in the next 3 fields of focus. Our education and training, where we look at how do we raise the ecological literacy of our community, how do we do outreach, how do we hold speaker series such as these, where we bring in thought leaders in the field to have kind of open discussions around the topics that we're truly trying to address in this day and age. We also do field days. I just came from a fantastic field day at our farm this morning, and the amount of people that show up from different backgrounds, who walk through different doors and are at the table for the conversation for different reasons is really astounding, and it's something that I'm continually inspired by. But we also have a technical training side of our work, where we really feel it's important to bring the skill sets to the farmers and ranchers through peer-to-peer learning, as well as facilitated intensives and workshops to get the skills on the ground and in the hands of those who are going to put them into practice the next day, the next season, the next year. We also have some deep work in our data and research and in science, working with both local and regional institutions, researchers, field scientists, to be able to collect more information around what are the indicators of soil health, around the fluxes and flows of biodiversity, as well as watershed dynamics, water resources, the small water cycle, and hydrological function. And so it kind of all wraps up into our enterprise development, giving our customers the options, the opportunities to purchase things, whether they're at the grocery store or they're at a restaurant, or they're making a decision of what to clothe their family with. We think it's important that people have an option to make a decision that has a more positive impact on the soils and the landscapes and the communities in which it's sourced from. And so we do that both by selling products that we grow into the marketplace, whether it be wine grapes or avocados or beef. But we also started a food brand, a small food brand that's really focused on bringing products forward from the producers that we respect and work with into the marketplace, and telling the story about what we do on the ground on the shelf. So that's a little arc and structure of our organization. And ultimately, what we're attempting to do here is recreate a culture of connection. You know, this is a time in which so many people are screaming, you know, they feel disconnected. And yet what we hope is that people can recognize that we are all connected, and we just need to kind of retrain ourselves to see those connections and to value them, as well as to value our unique role as humans in the forest ecosystem, not as visitors to the forest, not as observers of the forest, but as a potential keystone species in its living, thriving, functioning future. And that's a big part of what we feel the highest potential of this work is recognition of humans and our higher potential. One of the projects that we're really excited to be working on right now is in collaboration with Fibershed. This was a project funded through the California Healthy Soils Program. This is a multi-year demonstration plot out in the California Central Valley in the region of Buttonwillow. This project was specifically designed to look at the impact of alley cropping on cotton production. This was a property that had heavily degraded soils, high salt content, and we started to ask questions around what the suite of practices could be, should be, that would start to address some of the issues of wind erosion, of nutrient depletion, of soil structure and organic matter, as well as just the carbon sequestration potential of this landscape. And so we designed an alley cropping system with a main focus on white mulberries as a way
Jesse,
to.
Just to let you know, you got about 60 seconds.
Okay, thank you. White mulberries as a mechanism by which we can bring perennial root systems into this landscape, while also providing the windbreaks and the potential fodder. So this is a cycle of compost, cover crops, cotton, and then the perennial integration of Morris alba. The other project that I'll just mention is our Center for Regenerative Agriculture at Halama Canyon Ranch. And this is a visual of that 1,000 acres. It gives you an image of both where our education and research facilities are, as well as some of the larger kind of swaths of ecological sites and the ecotones that connect them. And this is the place where we really will start to look at how do we impact on a broader scale the other regional stakeholders. This is a kind of a contextual image of where we are at the proximity to Point Conception at the Horn of California, and some of the other neighbors in our area that are significant land stewards. And this is really what the potential is how do we address the rangeland ecology, riparian corridors, the sage scrub brush, the oak woodlands, and our managed agroforestry through the lens of regenerative principles and practices. And with that, these are just some simple mapping images of that property and our facilities. And I will wrap up with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse. It's so inspiring to see. I mean, all of between, Buttonwillow and Halama Canyon Ranch, just rooting these practices in the ground, in place, trialing them, experimenting. I feel like that's exactly what we need to be doing all over, the country, the world, just to really understand like what that higher potential is of an ecosystem and in relation to the human participants. I liked that comment about our part of our higher potential as humans is putting ourselves back in relationship in a more participatory way with these quite complex systems. So thank you. We're going to switch to Liz Carlisle. So Liz is an assistant professor in the environmental studies program at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. She's written 3 books about regenerative farming and agroecology, Lentil Underground, Grain by Grain, and most recently, Healing Grounds, Climate Justice and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. Along with her colleague, Nikki Mazzaroli, she's been conducting a research project interviewing farmers and ranchers throughout the state of California to document and better understand silvopasture systems. That's all you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. It's just a huge privilege to be here with such an incredibly brilliant and accomplished group of colleagues. Thank you, Jesse and Sonja, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Guido. And I'm actually really new to agroforestry, so I'm here with a lot of curiosity and a great deal of humility, and a lot of gratitude to Nikki, who totally conceived this project. It was her vision, and it was just really my fortune to be invited to collaborate with her. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we've learned through the first year here. So we're looking at just one of these categories of agroforestry that Sonja and Jesse and Mike so brilliantly laid out. We're looking at silvopasture, so the integration of animals with woody perennials. And we say woody perennials rather than just trees, because we want to capture the impact of these systems that Sonja was talking about with sheep grazing in vineyards. So we want to cast that net wide and thinking about how perennial plants and animals can be farmed together in ways that are ecologically synergistic. So we're just trying to find all the folks we can in California who are doing this and learn from their systems and come up with a little bit of a portrait of what's going on in California in silvopasture. so that we can understand better what some of the opportunities are, but also what some of the barriers are, and how policy or research or the kinds of things, the kinds of markets that Jesse's trying to create or that Sonja's involved in trying to create might help solve some problems for folks. So we've heard from 21 folks who are currently practicing silvopasture, as well as many folks who are interested in getting into it from all over the state, lots of really different geographies, and mostly from people who've started their silvopasture systems within the last 10 years. So it seems like this is something, as Sonja was saying, that's really on the rise. So it's an exciting moment to think about where these could go. And also from a really wide range of scales of producers, from really small farms to large ranches that are thinking about ways of integrating trees or other woody perennials. Lots of different livestock, but you can see the big word that's emerging in the middle of the word cloud here, which I think is very relevant to our Fibershed conversation. It's clear that sheep are playing a really large role, that they do a lot of that stuff that Sonja talked about in terms of weed management and in terms of soil health, and they're making sense for a lot of the folks that we talked to. As far as the woody perennials, here again, we heard about a lot of different kinds of fruit crops and nut crops and lots of things where people were sort of adding value. But we heard a lot about native plants. And here again, one word really popped out, which is that people are really interested in oak restoration, who are engaged in silvopasture as it appears in perhaps its infancy, at least in this sort of era in California. Of course, native herbivores and indigenous management and trees have all gone together for a long time in California history. So as far as kind of types of silvopasture we've seen, they kind of fall into one of these buckets. Some people are starting agriculture with the idea of doing a silvopasture system, an agroforestry system. In some cases, land trusts or other folks who have a conservation mission are integrating animals and woody perennials to meet those kinds of ecological restoration goals, not necessarily because they're looking to sell a product. And then we see, folks who've been working with ranches with livestock who are integrating trees, and then also the opposite, people who had orchards or who had vineyards who are incorporating animals. And then we've also heard quite a bit about contract grazers. So maybe folks who have orchards who aren't looking to buy animals themselves or sort of learn those systems, but who want to collaborate with somebody. And our project hasn't really captured very much about that because our sort of unit of analysis is a land manager or a landowner. But I think this is a really interesting arena to explore. Actually, most of the folks we've heard from have fallen into these categories of people who have an orchard or a vineyard and are adding animals. And the benefits, you've already heard from Jesse and Sonja and Mike about these things. I think this is kind of an early adopter crew. People have talked a lot with us about the carbon sequestration benefits, the ecosystem restoration benefits, but also about a lot of really kind of nuts and bolts agronomic stuff, like having animals helps with weed management, helps with fertility and soil health. As Sonja mentioned, saving labor or fuel time that you might otherwise be using to manage weeds. And then as far as, people who've been livestock producers, seeing the benefits of trees, talking about shade, but also talking about, in some cases, forage benefits. And then a whole host of other things, depending on the ecosystems folks are in, from fog catchment to just the idea of stacking enterprises and having more than one income generating activity on the same land. We have, of course, heard about challenges too, the cost of trees, the cost of infrastructure like fencing to protect those young trees or irrigation, the time involved in, again, sort of having those stacked enterprises, the learning curve, with the drought, as Sonja mentioned, in some cases, forage for animals in the summer being an issue. And then also, again, as Sonja mentioned about these developing markets, particularly in Southern California, people not really having an outlet for direct marketing their meat. And then a lot of the things that are kind of emerging for us that are interesting have to do with this idea that silvopasture is kind of in this stage where it's maybe only accessible for early adopters who already have a lot of capital and resources, who own at least part of their land, who can replant trees, even though they don't necessarily have cost share or other kind of support for that, who can install water and fencing, again, mostly on their own dime. So I think this really calls attention to the fact that we have some really interesting pilot systems in place that could show us where we could potentially go, and the ecological benefits, but we have a long way to go in terms of making these systems accessible to agricultural producers more broadly in California. And then
I'll let you know, Liz, you got about a minute left.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just note, I have a link at the bottom of the screen here. We do have our survey open through the end of the year. So if you're listening to this and you're a silvopasture producer and we haven't bugged you yet, or you have friends or colleagues who you're not sure if they've heard about this, we'd love to hear about your system and learn from you as well. Guido, who's speaking right after me, is one of the folks we've learned from, and we're just so grateful to him and everybody else who shared what they've learned in the course of adopting silvopasture. So I'll leave it there and pass it on to Guido. And again, thanks so much for the invitation to be here.
Thank you, Liz. Seeing those word clouds, I loved just seeing the themes that were popping out, sheep being pretty center, and then all the different tree species, oak being right at the center, mulberry native. I also appreciated just the breakdown of the different producer types and really trying to understand like who all these people are and how they're operating. It's helpful to see. Thank you. All right, so I have Guido. Guido Frosini is a land steward and tender at True Gas Farms outside of Tamales in northwestern Marin County. His family has been farming and ranching since the 1860s, and he has a deep commitment to the health of the soil and the land there. He manages cattle and sheep on the 120-acre farm and has been working with Marin RCD and Marin Carbon Project to develop a carbon farm plan for his land. He's been implementing and experimenting with a variety of agroforestry practices, such as planting hedgerows, establishing silvopasture systems of oak and chestnut, and planting riparian forest buffers. It's all you, Guido. I think you're muted. Oh, there you are.
Got you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. And it's such a pleasure to be part of
Guido,
this
I'm sorry, it's Gavin,
panel.
the producer. Okay, yeah, you just weren't full screen. You're full screen now. Thank you.
So Liz, thank you for that great presentation. It's been wonderful to see the growing interest, I think, in a lot of these manifestations of people just learning that we have an idea of what a healthy landscape does look like or don't at all. And we're coming in contrast with that understanding. So, what we think has been producing food for our growing population really now is falling apart with the shifting climate and with the lack of resiliency that was built into that mindset. So I think my generation is now learning alternative ways of coping with what we have been left with. So I started my journey 14 years ago. We are located 4 miles from the Pacific Ocean. It's like the northwestern tip of Marin County. It's a sandy loam. So like Mike said, home base is around 120 acres. When my great aunt passed away, that's how I was able to stay out here. She didn't have any kids. We currently manage around 1,200 acres. So, but home base is where we can experiment and have had the ability and the fortune and the privilege to, like I said, experiment with different agroforestry practices and agroecological practices as well. So just have a more resilient, a diverse approach to agriculture. The goal is to restore some of our broken water cycles, and that in turn helps soil building and nutrient cycling. These are a few of the practices that we engage with. And I think, like Jesse was saying as well, like just really bringing into the fold more of a science-based approach towards, how do we measure the goals that we set? And then how do we share those more often, more readily? Because that will help inform others, so that time spent in learning and developing new ways of establishing trees, of managing animals, doesn't have to be done by everybody over and over and over again. And I think that's one big shift in agriculture that we might be seeing, and I hope so, is a much more collaborative way of looking at solution-based approaches to food production, to community building, to access to land, and just to a general restorative communal way of being on this planet. So that's why community dialogue for us has been pretty big in trying to understand where we are, why we're here, and what are we doing about it, and how can we do it together. Adaptive grazing, really, we have spent hours, weeks, months, years raising animals that we enjoy being around, and vice versa. And these animals have been bred to be part of an ecosystem. We are a very specific bioregion. It's very wet. We have certain type of soils, certain type of topography. So I think I really want to see more herds, flocks that are endemic to areas that have parasite resistance, that can withstand and know how to adapt to the forage availability, and that includes shrubs and trees. And even though cows are grazers and we have goats and sheep that are more browsers, the idea of like integrating both and having forage available year round, even though the water cycles are limited in summer in California. So the idea of being able to put your animals also where you want, when you want them, in order to be able to protect your young seedlings, and also to graze just part of that tree in the younger stages. So this is all possible with electric fence. A few pictures of the different practices we have here. Ecological monitoring, so talking about like when we do plant, when we do graze, if we do rest a field, how do we get that information back? We have worked with Point Blue Conservation Science. These are just a few of the methods that are applied every 2 to 3 years, depending. And this gives us a sense of like, how is the soil shifting? How is the vegetation shifting? And the great thing too is about how is the wildlife population fitting in within the scenario? Like what kind of songs are we hearing? What kind of burrows, are we finding? And how many predators are there at any given time? Kind of gives you a sense of how healthy a landscape is. And this is just above ground. Of course, we're trying to get a little scene of what's below ground. And I think understanding, that's the beauty, I think, of a land tender, of a grazer, of a shepherd, is understanding that relationship of above and below ground populations and how healthy they are and how they express themselves year in and year out, and how to manage that biomass that we grow. So a few conservation practices. You can see on the left, spreading of compost. Below that, those were 2 soils. One was just exposed sand. And on the right, that was just covered through grazing. And the difference in temperature was almost 30 degrees. And so one, supports life, and one just supports a nice sand bath for chickens. We have our newly planted oak savanna. We have around 4 acres of oak savanna and chestnuts. They don't look as good this year, but I'm sure you can come visit. The riparian buffer that is wind protected looks just as good. That's your top right corner. We're experimenting with some small swales that retain water, and that's where we're planting trees with no irrigation. And then bottom right is around 2,000-foot hedgerow. We've seen increases in the majority of our fields from 3 to 5% organic matter. That also means that we are slowly sequestering carbon. These are projections through this tool that was developed by a few universities called Comet Planner. And so it's showing that we are sequestering with the trees and shrubs planted, with the hedgerows, the oak savanna, the riparian buffer. So it's around 56 metric tons of CO2. You can see the equivalents there. And this is just on 100 acres. What I find most fascinating, because it's the most accessible, is like with the practices, we are projecting that we are adding over, by 2025, with the practices implemented, we can increase our waterfall retention of 2 inches. So we are able actually to receive more water on this property and hold it within the soil. And to me, that is a tremendous feat of, like, when we're talking about average rainfall versus effective rainfall. And then last, I want to touch on the thing about the carbon farm plans that our local RCDs. So if somebody wants to know more, they can learn through the local RCD and the carbon farm plans. Within the carbon farm plans, something we are mentioning is cultural ecology. And you can take a time to read this, but really it's just recognizing where our soil fertility comes from, who tended it for so many, many years, and how we're benefiting from it, and how do we restore some kind of balance, and how do we restore the relationship to some of these elements that are not just so linear in food production, but really have so much more story. So the idea of, like, if we're just looking at carbon sequestration through eucalyptus versus a cultural practice and the diversity of our relational experience to our trees. You can come visit and you can learn more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guido. The idea of designing some of these systems based on endemic species, whether flocks or herds or trees or shrubs, I think that is a pretty core component of this. So thank you for weaving that in. And I love that Fukuoka quote in there about cultivation of perfect human beings, the perfection of human beings. All right, cool. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and open it up for just some discussion. I'm sure we've had a few questions come in from the audience through those presentations. Maybe we should we can address some of those. Lexi, have you seen any ones that you've called out? I haven't been totally monitoring the chat yet, but I see that there's quite a bunch of them.
Ashley said, have you made any attempts to restore native vegetation communities?
Okay. Guido, you want to take that one? I feel like it's something that you've been pretty actively doing right now.
So through this, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, through the studies with Point Blue, mostly around oak succession, or just success and succession, understanding the soil microbiology, and mostly regarding what mycorrhizae are present in order for tree establishment. The same goes for perennial plants. So a lot of our annual grasslands are extremely bacterial dominated. So having first and foremost a focus on how do we make our soils a bit more complex, a little more fungal dominated, so higher carbon amounts. So what we do is we graze with like higher residual dry matter, so leaving a lot of fiber behind, a lot of carbon. We were seeing a lot of more decomposing species out there fruiting, but also below ground, we're seeing that complexity that then gives us the ability that if we want to establish a more perennial crops like perennial grasses, shrubs, or trees, we are more set up for success because they have friends, if that makes any sense. And companion planting is huge with natives.
This is something that I'll just kind of piggyback on that, if you don't mind, because it's such a deep question that we're asking around native perennial grasses and some of the practices that we can lean on to either expand their presence in the landscape or establish their presence in the landscape. And I'll just bring up kind of some of the opportunities, I think, for tracking is some of the remote sensing work that people are working on right now to actually identify native perennial grasses in the summer months, as there are a lot of times the only things that are green still, so that we can track that over time and see how that overlays with different management units, depending on either grazing patterns or compost application or other soil tests to determine soil organic matter that's present at the time that you're seeing either retreation or expansion. And the other one is, trying to address some of the seeding. Like there are people who are doing pasture improvement and putting out cover crops. And I think that one of the things that we're really interested in learning more about is how to make perennial native grasses more accessible to add into those, and what are the conditions you need in order for them to actually take. But right now, there's not a lot of great sources that are cost effective for ranchers when doing pasture improvement seedings for native choices.
Thank you.
Mike, Lexi has a couple of questions for you, and I think Heather has one too, but if you want to go to Lexi, she
sure.
has two good questions, and Heather has a follow-up one.
Sure. Lexi, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Alyssa was wondering, she would love to hear more about how often and how these collaborations between vineyard and orchard owners and livestock owners are and can be set up. And is there any way to be doing, is there any work being done to enable easier connections between the two?
Liz, could you speak to that? Have you come across that at all in any of your findings? Working
I actually doubled
documenting.
down on that question in the chat. So I too am seeking answers.
Okay.
I'm looking at Sonja.
Well, I mean,
It's actually something I've been thinking about a lot. Like, we need to establish some kind of networking system to do that. I don't know if one having been done specifically, other than just people's own personal networks. Like some sheep grazers, you know, are getting to know a lot of growers and working around the landscape across whole regions now and things like that. But there's no formal system that I know of. So something to think about doing.
That seems to be a huge opportunity there. Yeah, go for it.
No, I was going to say, I don't know a formal one as well, although Heather just dropped mash graze into the chat, but I just will give an example. There's a woman here in the crowd named Cole Bush who does prescriptive grazing and contract grazing in Ojai. And some peers of ours, also Jack and Jenny at Cuyama Lamb, are doing it in the Santa Barbara kind of central coastal region. And Cole gave a presentation back in 2018, one of our first speaker series that we pulled together, these thought leaders, and she did a great presentation on prescriptive grazing for fire and fuel reduction. And what came out of that was a bunch of contracts for our colleagues Jack and Jenny at Cuyama Lamb. And now they're working across conservation landscapes, in public and private parks. They're working for the fire department. They're working for schools. They're working for some viticulturists. They're working in some orchards. They're cleaning up some ranches. And it was amazing to see the explosion of interest, having someone like Cole come in and set the foundation because she wasn't working in the area yet. And then for us to say, now here's some people in the crowd who actually can take that call. And so just instances like that where we've got to bring, that's one of the things I missed the most about the meeting in person, was getting everyone in a room over some drinks and some food and being able to hand some cards around.
I share that. This is, I mean, it's a strange format that this is taking, and it's also, it's got its pros too. It's kind of like the internet is the it's our version of like the mycelial networks I see facilitating connections across oceans. I mean, the conversation earlier from LA to Accra, Ghana, just internet, is a wild thing it's providing, but it's also not quite the same as being in person. I see we have a question from Leon. You mentioned, this is a question for Liz. It's all scrolling around. You mentioned there's a need for market development for hedgerows in your study area. What factors pose the biggest challenge to market development for agroforestry products? Are there any success stories you've seen and can share?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think actually both Jesse and Sonja can speak kind of more broadly to those questions, because Sonja is doing a lot more research around it, and Jesse's actually doing it. So there's no way to learn about barriers better than if you have to overcome them. But I was actually referencing specifically barriers to meat products in Southern California. So I moved here, I was in the Bay Area for about 10 years, and there's somewhat of like a direct market meat scene up in the Bay Area, and CSAs that you can belong to around meat products. So there's not as much of that in Southern California, which is something I actually learned from Matt Shapiro, who works for Agriculture and Natural Resources and is specifically the rangeland person in this area. And I know he's doing a lot of work around trying to establish more of these kind of small scale regional processing facilities, because I think that's one of the biggest bottlenecks, as far as, say you wanted to buy livestock directly from Jesse because you like the way it's produced, as part of this integrated system. We don't seem to have the infrastructure in place to facilitate that. And it seems like most of the livestock producers in this region are kind of just stuck with the commodity market. So that seems like one important infrastructure gap to address in order to make it more possible for people to really get paid for the kind of ecological value that they're adding.
Yeah, that's a
Great answer, Liz. And that makes me think too, how like in the elderberry realm, we've talked to there are some large scale companies that make products, like elderberry based, like health products and things like that, where the price, it's a matter of scale and price. And I mean, for at least the small scale farmers we've been working with currently with the elderberry project, and it doesn't mean that it has to stay small scale, but the kinds of volumes they need are hard to amass at that scale unless you start thinking about co-ops and things like that, which there is an elderberry co-op in the Midwest, which is growing and it looks like it's doing well. And then the other issue is price. And, how do we actually, I mean, the price they wanted to offer was really extremely low for, just the effort that these farmers put in. I mean, there's the whole issue of how do we really pay for the ecosystem services and how do we get the consumers to understand that there even is such a thing as an agroforestry system that's doing more beneficial things for your ecosystem than some other monocropping system. And how does that get reflected in higher prices, which is often what's needed for the producers. So that's, it's a big, I think, consumer education issue, partly.
Yeah, I imagine there's quite a, I'll go for it.
Please, sir.
Oh, I was just going to say, I imagine there's, quite a lot of just storytelling that needs to be involved in the marketing to educate people rather than, I don't know if like any kind of new certification type of thing is the way to go, but just, educating people about what this entails to bring those costs in. But Jesse, I would love you to speak to that because you're right in the middle of that, I imagine, right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think across the board, as we've gone down this avenue of product development, regional processing has been a major limiting factor. And this is across the board, whether it be from, tree crops or animal livestock production. And Guido can speak more. I mean, he's been intimately involved with, I think it's the Bar C, or there's a regional cooperative who's pulling together a processing facility up by him. And I know that that's been a big lift, but an absolute necessary one to support what they're doing on the ground. Another one I think is really interesting to address is externalities and co-benefits of, not sure why I muted there. I think another interesting component is the positive externalities and co-benefits of agroforestry that somehow need to be accounted for. And it may not be at the farm gate or in your purchase agreements. And so, we're seeing a lot of these fall into funding priorities, both for kind of research and philanthropic giving, but also through healthy soils programs and other grant incentives and equip. So that's like for establishment a lot of times and kind of get things off the ground. But for the kind of long term, for the long arch of that enterprise, it's going to be interesting to see how we can leverage either carbon credits or the co-benefits of the hydrological impact or the biodiversity impact that agroforestry has that can provide another financial incentive for producers that would allow them to take a competitive kind of clearinghouse price to some larger buyers, while also making it effectively support, as Sonja mentioned, all that goes into establishing, waiting multiple years for harvest, and then adding the complexity of tending an elderberry hedge on a riparian corridor, as well as growing row crops, or another thing that has a little bit more of a tried and true path to market.
Yeah, that reminds me of just our conversation when you were going through some of those spreadsheets, when you were looking at time horizons and multiple crops and trying to parse out all of just the complexity of some of these more integrated systems that are incorporating so many more species together. I think that's where monoculture, kind of the model, why it's excelled so much is because there's a straightforwardness to just input, output. It's very mechanical. And here, when we're talking about ecosystems and all of the benefits that come, and then time horizons of perennials versus annuals and tree species. Could you speak a little bit more to that, actually, Jesse, with how you've been navigating just some of that complexity, like sharing some of those the spreadsheets that you showed me, and how you've addressed that, because there's just so much more complexity here.
Well, we started down this channel when we were discussing the different enterprises that could potentially evolve out of the Halama Canyon Ranch. And, our purview is always trying to address a ecosystem concern, trying to restore something within the ecosystem through the enterprises of agriculture. And so whether it's degraded riparian corridors, or overgrazed rangeland, or stressed oak woodlands, or overcrowded fire-prone sage scrub brush, all these things are stuff that we feel we need to improve the whole ecological system at the ranch. But we want to show models for doing that also have a financial return, so that it can spread beyond the boundaries of just our property. It can live outside of our nonprofit organization. We want to create the models that other producers can actually take up, and then appropriately design for their context. And what we started to do was look at how much difficult it was to pick and choose one versus the other, whether it was like, I want to grow mushrooms in the oaks, or I want to grow elderberries in the riparians, or I want to plant trees in my rangeland. And some people are like, well, what if I just want to do one of them? And yes, you can, but so much of it's complex, but so much of the symbiosis comes from the output of one feeding into the input of the other. So if you're going to do bale grazing in some degraded landscape to finish your animals at the end of spring, but then you do it at the point in which you're going to be planting your orchard or your silvopasture system, is that a feed cost for your livestock, or is that an establishment cost for your agroforestry? And just creating those toggles and levers within the structures of a financial pro forma was a really interesting exercise, and just illuminated a lot of kind of what works and what doesn't when the financial constraints are highlighted.
I love that. I mean, yeah, there's ideally no waste. It's just waste is a human construct, and feeding from one processor system into another as an input. That's the way that it's worked for how many billion years. We have a question from Bronte. Let's see. Curious about any suggestion.
Hey, Mike, I'm so sorry. We're sending you a bunch of in the chat, a bunch of questions in the chat. So I just want to make sure that you're seeing those, because Lexi and Heather seem to be sending a ton of them to you.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing this one from Bronte. Curious about any suggested vocational programs at the intersection of regenerative grazing, silvopasture, etc. Liz, Guido. Anything.
Cole, can we unmute Cole? Because I feel like,
Yeah.
Cole, are you teaching people?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak for the fact that we're very excited about inviting Cole Bush to be a guest facilitator at our upcoming Holistic Management Intensive that starts December 6th. So we're running a 10-day intensive focused on holistic managed grazing, financial planning, ecological monitoring, land planning, holistic context. And so Cole Bush is going to come and be a guest facilitator to that. But I know she also has a much more robust training platform that she's been developing for quite a few years. And we're hoping to garner some more interest and support for that at our holistic management course. But definitely, I think that someone already dropped a link for her. I don't know if she's able to jump off. But yeah, definitely
She's
support
here.
her.
We could, are you here, Cole? Let's see. Maybe not.
No, sorry, we're just chatting behind Mike. We're just going to move you over to the Discord, to the Fibershed Symposium Discord, if you can take a look at that, because we are firing a ton of questions in, but you're not seeing them because people are typing in the main area. So that's no problem. There should be one in the Discord now for you.
Discord. I'm seeing one. A question from Megan at Interlace Agroforestry. Let's see. I asked earlier, what are the tree and crop interactions being established in the alley cropping system? Are you thinking about spatial and temporal partitioning? Is the intervention stable, evolving, or ephemeral? Is it designed to be dynamic over time? That is an excellent question.
Just quickly,
Jesse.
is that the alley cropping of cotton that this person's asking about? Yeah. So what we've heard is that cotton is going to get shaded out possibly at a certain point. We don't know, unless this I mean, it could be that the mulberry is kept as a hedge, but traditionally alley cropped cotton that I've seen in Southeast Asia does well for a certain amount of time, and then it gets shaded out, and you have to think of a transition there, which could be a understory that's this forage for livestock. Other than that, I don't know what other temporal systems you were thinking of applied to other things that Jesse or Guido were discussing. I just had the cotton in mind. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll the reason why, one of the reasons why the mulberry was the Morris Alba was chosen was because mulberry takes so well to coppicing and pollarding, as well as it has such a high nutritional content for forage and fodder. So over time, as sheep and grazing can be more incorporated into that cotton alley cropping system, it would provide that and would be able to keep their system, that perennial system, at a low enough height to not out compete the intercrop.
Thank you. We have another one. What's the economic modeling for the cotton and mulberry intercropping? Have you been involved with that part, Jesse?
That's more of an evolving conversation, since we were really looking at the demonstration factor of harvest and application, as well as the soil and carbon component to it as well. So I do not have deep info on that part.
Got it. There's lots of questions. Okay, let's see. Curious to know from Gina, curious to know what the biggest obstacles to orchards or other farming operations in planting cover crops. How are tree seedlings protected? I've seen what looks like PVC tubes around seedlings up to a few feet. Is that the method that's predominantly used, or are there other methods? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, as far as the
Cover crops, there's been a few more recent studies on that now. I think there's just, depending on the tree crop, there's a lot of different concerns that growers have. For example, some people worry about frost damage to the bloom, during the bloom period for almonds that bloom so early, and whether the cover crop kind of, as being high up, kind of produces more frost, although my colleagues who have researched this actually find that isn't necessarily the case. And there's also concerns about, talking again about like almonds and walnuts that are ground harvested. There's concern about like getting trash in your harvest, in terms of, does the cover crop break down fast enough over the summer to not be leaving all these chunks of plant material. And it seems that the growers who actually try these things don't find a lot of problem with these issues. And if there are problems, there are other equipment that can kind of clean your harvest. So there are a lot of concerns which seem to kind of stem also from just lack of enough people out there kind of trying it, as far as just the cover cropping in orchards goes. And so, yeah, I think we need more demonstration sites and more growers out there doing it. As far as the tree protection, maybe one of you can speak to that, but I've certainly, in our elderberry project, there was, there were the tree tubes, I think, as the questioner asked. Those were used and then removed after a certain number of months or a certain amount of growth.
Guido, you want to speak to that a little bit? How you've been establishing trees in the riparian areas or in the silvopasture? What kind of protection you've been using? Yeah,
so we could have a whole session just based on that, but we have used tree tubes. Great place for wasps to grow. And I think just as long as you're selecting species in the beginning, especially if you have like very barren landscape, try to really take in consideration what's deer proof, what is, might have some exudates against gophers, which are a huge deal in establishing, especially if you're watering trees. We found that was a big hurdle, is like when to water your oaks, because when you do it in the middle of the summer, when they're actually already thirsty, then that's when the gophers find them, even when you have gopher cages, and they'll just kind of air prune because their tunnels lead to the gopher cage, but that still exposes the roots. So we've seen some dieback there. So just being mindful of like timing, really like finding rootstock that's there, using, endomycorrhizae, as an inoculant when you're planting. Those are all things like really focusing on the type that does best in that environment, especially if you're in a harsh environment, not just in like, prime agricultural land. That's my highest recommendation. I'm happy to discuss more with somebody. But in terms of protection for, we've used anything from electric fence to like heavy duty cattle panels. So if you have bulls in a field, you need T-posts and cattle panels because they'll get lice and they'll scratch and they'll destroy it.
Yeah, a whole variety of strategies. We have a question from Marie. Can anyone talk about limits to animal perennial crop integration due to regulations like FSMA?
Well, I know that
as far as the food safety concerns, in like our standard California orchard crops, they're harvested often in summer or late summer, early fall. And so if you do the grazing during the winter time and then remove the animals like with a 90-day interval, that's usually considered fine for a food safety perspective. But I know this question comes up a lot in this context of animal grazing. I don't know if others have any thoughts on it.
I'll just say that Kelly Mulville from Piscines, who's doing sheep grazing in vineyards and is really all about year-round grazing and actually training the vines to be taller so that the sheep can be in there year-round. Definitely mentioned the advantage of a fermented product because it sort of gets around this.
right, it does a lot.
Depend on what you're doing with your crop afterwards, if there's like a kill step involved. And also, if the crop never touches the ground, if it's like fresh peaches that you're harvesting from a ladder or something, that's a very different situation, and I don't think as much concern.
Yeah. I have another question from Monica. This is for Guido. Could you speak more on your relationship with the Coast Miwok people and how you're both honoring and incorporating their history, practices, and/or traditions?
So it is a relationship that, you know, it's at the pace of trust building. So it takes a long time, and it's really initial, just first a dialogue. We've had our first actual conversations with the official tribe. So the federally recognized Coast Miwok tribe, the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria. We have been working on our carbon farm plan to implement land acknowledgement piece to incorporate the cultural ecology component. At the moment, we've just had some two site visits at the moment, and potentially we'll be collaborating on some riparian food forest and geophyte gardens. So geophytes were plants that stored carbohydrates in their roots and were a pretty important food source, especially in winter and dry months. So not many are left because nobody's cultivating them, and they'll die off and be overrun by grasses. So the idea is like incorporating more tending and having more of a management plan that involves overnight stays from people. It's really creating a sense of place and welcome, not just being like, you want some fiber, you want some, you know, just it's more like just come and camp and stay and see what you think of this place again. That is what we're trying to establish first.
Yeah, at the speed of trust. Gosh, that I feel like that's the only way it can be. We have a question from Tommy. Do you know of any integration of rabbits into silvopasture or rotational grazing systems? Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
The only people that I know that are raising rabbits as part of a small scale project with spring restoration and agroforestry is up in the Cuyama Valley at Quail Springs Permaculture. I don't know at what scale, but what the scale, but I know it was a major part of their protein production for their on-site residents up there at that permaculture teaching and learning oasis. But yeah, I think Brenton Kelly was managing that system for a while, but Quail Springs Permaculture.
There's a comment to tons of rabbit integration in silvopastoral systems in France from Megan. All right, well, we're getting close to the close here. Any last things that you all would like to address or bring up or speak to before we round out this discussion? So many things we could talk about. This could be days.
I'd just like to put in another plug. I mean, what I found in the small survey that we did back in 2018 of agroforestry practitioners is that many of them, actually, a surprising number of them, mentioned how it does entail a lot more management complexity. You know, you do have different, I think what I'd like to see eventually is that we come up with designs that aren't more complex to manage because they're managing themselves. You know, the ecological interactions are happening. It seems like we're at the early stages here where those designs maybe haven't been totally worked out yet. So that's one thing, is I'd like to work on that. But the reality is, you know, there might be more complexity, at least at the outset, if not for always. And so I would like to put in another plug for that whole idea of people really need to get together and share land in a way where different people are taking care of different enterprises that are stacked on the same piece of land. And we need some mechanisms for that. I think the Savannah Institute has published some guides on like how to do that, how to set up agreements like that between different people managing different parts of an agroforestry system. And so I think we need to really boost those kinds of efforts too.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Some closing words before we head out. All right, well, thank you all so
I just
much.
wanted
Oh yeah, of course.
Julian Marenchild,
That's
Oak
great.
Woodlands, just highly recommend if anybody wants to just get a little kick out of how amazing oaks are and what lives in and around them. Just it's a good book to introduce you to the beauty and complexity of trees.
What was
This is
the
California
title, Guido?
ecosystems.
Could you read the title for everyone?
Yeah, Secrets of the Oak Woodlands.
Yeah.
And it said Kate Marenchild.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming out and taking some time, sharing your stories, sharing your research, what you're experimenting on. Oh, yeah, we got another book. What was that one? It was kind of blurry.
No, it's funny because I was just asked as a tour for the Silvopasture, a guide to managing grazing animals, forest crops, and trees in temperate farm ecosystems. So it's another really solid one for the bookshelves for anyone who's interested in this work.
Could you say that one more time? I missed it.
Yeah.
Oh, Steve Gabriel. Excellent. Yeah, thank you all again for coming out. This has been a fantastic discussion. We could talk plenty more. There's so much to be said here, these different systems and the potential here. But for now, yeah, we'll close it out for now and continue the conversation. So thank you.